Well, thank you to all our panelists who just spoke, and thank you, John Kemeny, for a great keynote. As I said at the start, there would be, in fact, some sharp differences of opinion on nuclear power today, and I think you've seen them already, but I think that adds to the richness of this discussion about a very, very important topic. Our next panelists will explore the current state of nuclear power, where things are, in fact, today in this country and around the world. And again, I think we're going to hear some differing views on the status of nuclear power today. Our first speaker, Dan Allegretti, is a vice president at Exelon, the nation's utility with the largest number of nuclear reactors. Dan is responsible for legislative and regulatory matters across the Northeast for Exelon. He has over 20 years of experience in the electric power industry, and while at Exelon and Constellation, he's directed a team helping to shape the development of our electricity laws and regulations in the Northeast. At the federal level, he served as Constellation's Director of Wholesale Energy Policy and has participated in a variety of proceedings before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He was named by Governor Baldacci of Maine in 2007 to serve on the Maine Energy Council. He holds a law degree from Georgetown and a BA from Colby College. Dan.
Dan, thanks very much for that introduction. It's interesting, as we turn from looking at the past to the present, I think 3 Mile Island was certainly a wake-up call with regard to nuclear safety, and there is a lot to be considered there. We learned a great deal from that, and I think, not just as a company, but as an industry, really, going forward. But when we think about the enormous implications of nuclear safety, and we think about the fact that there are indeed other ways of making electricity, it sort of begs the question, why should we make electricity from nuclear plants? What are the benefits? What are the things that are unique to nuclear power or different about nuclear power that we should take on the awesome responsibility of managing the risk of nuclear safety? And that's where I'd like to sort of begin, is to walk through a little bit where we are with regard to the benefits and the positive aspects of nuclear. First of all, we already just rely on it for an enormous amount of our electricity here in the United States of America. It's about 20% of our energy supply. To try and replace that with something else is an awesome challenge. And if you think about it in terms of being an emission-free source of electricity, it represents about 62% of the clean generation, significantly larger than the next closest source, which would be hydropower, at a little over 22%. They are phenomenally reliable facilities because of the baseload nature of their operations. They're on all the time. And we've seen tremendous increases in the capacity factors of nuclear plants. Dan, that's jargon. What do you mean capacity factor? It's how many of the 8,760 hours a year it actually runs at full output, how many megawatt hours it can generate. And the capacity factors in the nuclear industry today are above 90%. That's a significant increase from the roughly 70% to 80% capacity factors in the 1970s. It provides benefits to the electric grid, voltage support. The fuel is the smallest part of the power production costs of any major generation source, and so it's inexpensive to operate once it's up and running. I often hear a lot of talk about green jobs, the employment, the tax, the economic benefits that power plants produce for the communities in which they reside are often important to policymakers. They're an issue I get asked about a lot. The employment associated with a nuclear power plant is phenomenal. It takes roughly 400 or 500 people to run one. Try to put that in context. We operate natural gas-fired combined cycle plants in Boston. We do round-the-clock shifts with about 28 people. So enormous amount, and these are highly skilled jobs. These are jobs for engineers and highly trained, highly skilled people. They pay a lot of money in taxes. I mean, it certainly is a benefit to local communities. But I think when you think about the benefit of nuclear power, the most important factor to consider is climate change. There just isn't anything else in the next decade to 2 decades that is going to be capable of producing the amount of emission-free electricity, carbon-free electricity that comes from nuclear energy. I would be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for Exelon. We're very proud of our operating record, nuclear power plants. We're very proud of being one of the nation's largest generators of clean electricity. That's not just nuclear. We have a very large fleet of hydroelectric and wind and solar resources as well. But on the nuclear side, we generate 25% of the nuclear electricity in America. And that is a very large number, and it is an awesome responsibility for our company. I think I heard the phrase cash cow. Someone might have mentioned it. Whether that was the case when natural gas was $13 a million British thermal units, for many nuclear power plants operating today in America, that is not the case. There are enormous headwinds, challenges that are facing the existing fleet of nuclear power plants. The first is obviously the low cost of this bounty of natural gas that has come to us through the process of hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling. Well, you know, exactly. The recession combined with the enormous strides we've made with energy efficiency as well have led to a very flat level of demand growth for electricity. That, along with natural gas, have created significant downward pressure on energy prices. We also have to compete in the marketplace with resources that may be receiving subsidies. And there may be very good public policy reasons to promote those resources, but that does create an increase in supply, downward pressure on prices, and does put additional pressure on nuclear assets. Dr. Kelly mentioned the somewhat strange phenomenon of negative pricing that we sometimes see in the Midwest, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. It's an interesting phenomenon. There are transmission constraints that often create challenges for nuclear power plants where power may be bottled up in a region of the grid and unable to reach other parts of the demand for electricity that could be more beneficial. We've also seen significant increases in the cost to operate nuclear plants, the overhead, the operating expenses, as well as the price of uranium. The cost of fuel has gone up significantly. We still are able to procure adequate supply, but at a higher price. Over the border in Vermont, Vermont Yankee has announced it's shutting down. There's another plant out in Wisconsin, Kewanee, that Dominion operates that's shutting down. The San Onofre plant in California will be closing. Oyster Creek in New Jersey, Crystal River in Florida. There's a significant number of retirements on the horizon, and this is reflective, I think, of in large part, the economic challenges facing nuclear plants, particularly in the organized market areas of the country. I got a bunch of quotes up here. I won't run through them all in the interest of time, but I do want to talk about, in particular, what distinguishes one plant from another in terms of these economic challenges. They're not all the same. First of all, there are significant economies of scale in the operation of a nuclear power plant. And so a plant like Vermont Yankee, which is about 600 megawatts, 570, 600 megawatts, that's a small plant. And there's a single reactor at the Vermont Yankee site. That's the most vulnerable type of plant in terms of the economic pressures that it faces. Facilities that are multiple units that have more than one plant at the single location, or that are larger. A larger plant like Seabrook Station, which is about 1,100 megawatts, significantly bigger than Vermont Yankee, has a different economic profile. So it's the smaller units. The other aspect of this is location. Energy markets are regional across the United States, the wholesale markets, and the prices vary. And this chart kind of gives you a picture. You can see on the left-hand side the different cost structure for the different type of nuclear generation unit. On the right-hand side, you can see the revenues available in the various organized markets in the U.S. And so you can see that in particular, the small units in markets like the MISO or Western PJM are significantly uneconomic. Even some of the larger units look pretty marginal under this analysis. So what, Dan? I mean, you know, it's a market. If they can't compete, we should just start closing these nuclear power plants. Well, there's a major consequence to that. And this morning I came downstairs, I made a pot of coffee, I fixed some cereal, let the dog out, And I opened this morning's Wall Street Journal. Here it is. Japan's answer to Fukushima. Coal. Right, this morning's paper. The carbon issue is a major, major challenge without nuclear power. If you look at where we are in terms of carbon reduction goals today in the U.S., you set your target at 17% reduction by 2020. I think that's what the administration is looking for. We've made enormous progress, and a lot of that is due to the fuel switching away from coal to natural gas, just driven by the economics of the abundance of natural gas. Some of that is also driven by the lack of growth in demand. Once you move from switching from coal to gas and you start switching from nuclear to gas, you start to move in the other direction. And you can take a look at this chart. You can see if you hypothecate a 25% reduction in the fleet, you can see a significant increase in carbon production that you're going to have to offset with something else. You're going to have to find another way to significantly reduce carbon. That's a pretty big step backwards in terms of the progress that we've achieved to date. And it has some pretty serious implications. This map here shows what the trend has been, and you can see the trend in coal gas switching taking place right now. MATS retirements, that's the mercury air toxics rule from the EPA. It's actually had, I think, probably a bigger impact in driving coal retirements than the EPA carbon rules will, but we're seeing the effect of that. As you start to bottom out around 2016, we start to see the nuclear retirements kick in, and we can begin with the ones that have already been announced and hypothecate others. You can see that the trend on carbon moves significantly upward. Dan, can't we just build more wind? Wouldn't that be safer than nuclear power plants? The problem with wind is that it's not a base-loaded resource, nor is it what we call a dispatchable resource, one we can flip on when we need it and shut it off when we don't. It works when the wind blows, and it isn't there when it doesn't. And one of the significant problems, and it's illustrated here in this chart, is that on the times when you really, really need it, those hot, still days in the middle of summer, is the time when you get the least amount of wind production. It frequently doesn't time well with the hourly demand, the daily demand in the electricity markets. This is all to say that resources like renewables, like wind, play an important role in a power system. They are highly beneficial, but we cannot rely on them exclusively. There is also a role for resources like nuclear power that creates a significant benefit to system reliability and a significant benefit in terms of meeting our environmental policy goals. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. A good view of where things are with one of the nation's largest nuclear utilities. We'll now hear from a top official in the French nuclear industry. As you heard earlier, one of the largest producers of nuclear power in the country, with 80% of France's electricity coming from its nuclear fleet. Franck Carré is Scientific Director of the Nuclear Energy Division at the French Commission for Atomic and Alternative Energies. He's contributed to studies on advanced nuclear systems such as light water reactors, fusion reactor blankets, and space power reactors. Among other things, he has managed reactor and fuel cycle physics within the Department of Reactor Studies, national R&D programs on fast neutron reactors, high temperature reactors, and he's been actively involved in collaborative programs on future nuclear energy systems in Europe, and as you heard earlier, has worked with the U.S. and other countries on the next generation technologies. He's also an associate professor at the École Polytechnique and a professor at the National Institute for Nuclear Sciences and Technologies. In 2010, Mr. Carré was named Knight of the National Order of Merit in France. Franck Carré.
Well, Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to participate in this great anniversary symposium of the 3 Mile Island accident and to learn a lot about the historical and the human dimension of this great event that marked nuclear power in the world. I'll strive to touch upon 3 topics in my talk to give you a brief overview of the nuclear status and perspective in France, and to also strive to address the influence that, let's say, European Commission might have on, let's say, this perspective through the, let's say, the directions that it sets for climate and for energy, as well as to also address the influence of the 3 major nuclear accidents that occurred on our perspectives in France. In fact, we came to nuclear for energy security reasons, and the current fleet of pressurized water reactors was really initiated by the order of 6 pressurized water reactors to Westinghouse in the late 60s. And this, in fact, came at the same time where the first oil shock occurred in the early 70s. And then other orders of 900 pressurized water reactors were placed to Westinghouse, and leading to the first, let's say, series of 34 900 megawatt pressurized water reactor. Then this type of reactor was franchised and then upgraded to unit powers of 1300 megawatts and 1450, and this led to the current fleet of 58 pressurized water reactors that currently produces a bit less than 75% of our electricity. We currently have 1 unit in construction. This is in Normandy. This is the first unit of the European pressurized water reactor in France. And this is meant to really get a first experience of this new generation of light water reactors prior to ordering other units for replacing the existing operating reactors. Nuclear is so important to France. I would say that France has progressively mastered all steps of the nuclear fuel cycles, from the mining, the enrichment, fuel fabrication, spent fuel reprocessing, as we have a spent fuel reprocessing plant in Normandy on the site of La Hague, and we currently recycle 1 time the plutonium that is recovered from the uranium spent fuel. And currently, this is the current situation. And in fact, the effect of this very active deployment of nuclear energy over 20 years, 58 units over 20 years, from 1977 to 1999, in fact, the effect was really very important regarding the self-sufficiency of France regarding energy self-sufficiency. And in fact, the initial dependency on imports for our energy needs that was 80% at the time. The first unit was ordered, which decreased to 50%, and it's still at this level at the moment, even though the demand has steadily increased. The other important effect was a dramatic decrease of the CO2 emissions by a factor of 2 released by the French industry. And still today, I would say we're among those countries that are really emitting the least CO2 per capita and per year. And this was shown by Dr. Kelly. So typically 6.5 tons per capita and per year. Another effect was the fact that maybe because of the standardization of these nuclear power plants, in fact, our electricity is one of the less expensive, at least in Europe, and certified cost by the France's Court of Auditors really sets the price around 54 euros per megawatt hour, including waste management, dismantling, safety upgrades, with a margin of uncertainty of the range of 10 euros per megawatt hour. And this is typically, let's say, at least 50% less than the cost of electricity in our neighbor in Germany. What are next prospects? The next prospects are the way our utility EDF envisions the future is really operate these plants as long as they are authorized to do so, and the life extension of some of these plants on a case-by-case basis is really the first step. The other step is really to acquire experience on this first EPR unit that is currently being built, and to start renewing the fleet by generation 3 type of reactors, either that are similar to this EPR or some upgraded or improved types of EPR. Of interest is the fact that such an energy-poor country like France, and maybe with a strong centralized management, I would say so far. So we had an interest from the beginning, from the 60s, in the fast breeder reactors for the sake of really maturing a technology of, let's say, sustainable nuclear. In this, acknowledging the fact that fast breeder reactor has the physical capability to burn, let's say, in theory, 100% of natural uranium, whereas existing reactors burn 0.5% of it. And acknowledging that and fearing that, in fact, the nuclear would develop so rapidly that we would lack of uranium and that the prices of uranium would rise so steeply that we would need to have a type of nuclear that would just make use of the existing depleted uranium stocks that we have on the natural ground and not depend on really imports of natural uranium. So we had a strong program from the 60s to 1998, and at that time our program was just stopped by political, let's say, decisions. So we had a socialist green coalition that really opposed to the continuing operation of Super Phoenix in 1998, and it took us 8 years to be authorized to restart the research on this type of reactor. And the current program that is the major focus of our work on future nuclear energy systems is, has been mentioned by Dr. Kelly. This is working on a prototype or technology demonstrator of a new generation of fast breeder reactor that would really achieve progress in terms of economics as well as in terms of safety and operability. And if ever, let's say, we have political support and also the money, and of course this will be an international endeavor, even though it's meant to be built in France. Well, this project will start, let's say, in the mid of the 2020s. Now, what are the current, and so this is the vision of the utility. The vision of the government at the moment would be to really determine the level of nuclear we would have in the next decades. The scheme, the global scheme is the one I have indicated, but really the government will decide the share of nuclear that we will have in our electricity production, and also it will decide on the future of this project, Astrid, of a technology demonstrator of a new generation of fast breeder reactors. Now, well, nuclear is also very important for Europe. Typically, nuclear produces about 30% of Europe's electricity. And in fact, but as you know, there are mixed feelings about, well, let's say, among European countries on nuclear. And therefore, it was impossible until 2008, I would say, to reach a consensus of the need to jointly prepare the future of, let's say, European nuclear technologies. The cooperative programs that we could lead in Europe until 2008 was really a cooperative program on optimizing the use of existing nuclear power plants. I mean, working on the management of nuclear waste, working on safety, working on radiation protection. But it was politically incorrect to join forces to work on, say, fast breeder reactors or high temperature reactors or other sorts of future reactors. What happened in 2008, in fact, was, let's say, strong directions that had been expressed by the European Commissions in terms of energy and climate policy. And the directions were really energy efficiency, reduce by 20% the energy demand by 2020. The second direction was really develop with a strong will renewable energies. And the third was climate change considerations and cut by 20% the greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And in fact, the energy strategy plan was launched at the same time, and fission was acknowledged at the same level as renewable energies or carbon sequestration and storage and storage, or smart grids or other technologies as being an enabling technology to meet those goals. And this made it possible really to extend the cooperative work to preparing the future and to work on fast reactors and other types of future reactors within a sustainable nuclear energy technology platform, which is a kind of consortium of industry and laboratories joining forces and expressing directions for the future. And the three, let's say the triangle that you have here, through the three directions that are of this research: improved light water reactors, fast neutron reactors with a closed fuel cycle, and cogeneration. I mean, extending the range of applications of nuclear beyond the sole production of electricity, and this includes the production of high temperature heat. This includes high temperature reactors. Now, of course, these directions had to be considered in France, and I would say that energy efficiency as well as developing renewable energies matched well with the initial goal of energy security. And so we just endorsed these directions, and let's say considering nuclear and renewable energies as two pillars of a low carbon energy source was just meant as diversifying in fact, the fleet of low energy sources. And in addition to that, we also endorsed the goal of reducing the greenhouse gas effects emissions by 20% by 2020, even though we had good records already in greenhouse gas emissions, which is very demanding in the sense that it really calls for displacing fossil fuels for transport, for industry, or for the housing. And this is currently one of the goals of our energy policy. In addition to that, I would say we had a president that was elected in 2012 and with the support of the Greens, and in fact he said strong commitments, I would say, to nuclear before being elected. And such as, let's say, the share of nuclear in the electricity generation should be reduced to 50% by 2025. And also that he would shut the eldest nuclear plant, Fessenheim, by 2016. And which is at the border of Germany. And you see a recent demonstration that with a poster, let's say, on the Fessenheim saying stop risking Europe. So those are the ingredients, I would say, of an energy policy act that is just in preparation, that will be promulgated later this year, and that has been preceded by a national debate on energy transitions. So really the dimensions that we will find in this energy policy act are energy efficiency and sobriety, this is one, and displacing fossil fuels by nuclear and renewable energies, and so as to really contribute to this achieving this factor of 4 reduction by 2050 in our economy. Now, I'll briefly address the impact that major nuclear accidents had on our, let's say, energy nuclear, let's say, policy. Well, 3 Mile Island had a strong impact in the nuclear community, as really this affected the type of reactors that we had chosen and that was so much standardized in our country. And I would say nuclear professionals really contributed very actively in, let's say, the international understanding of what happened and the type of research that should be done on severe accidents, as well as on, let's say, ways to improve this type of reactor so as not to replicate the conditions that led to this type of accidents. Certainly the Electric Power Research Institute requirements were some initiating process. We had in France some requirements from the city authority in 1991, complemented by requirements of the electric utilities. And there were really guidelines to work on, let's say, an advanced light water reactors. Well, for the public, I think CMI had a little of concern, I think, because in fact there was no offsite effect, and also because this took place on another continent. Whereas Chernobyl had a much stronger impact, as in fact a radioactive plume had swept the western part of Europe, and that it was really a concrete sign, even though the technology was different, it was really a concrete sign that in fact nuclear technology could be really, could really perturbate and more than that, really jeopardize the economic activity of wide regions. And in fact, this triggered the negative sentiments on nuclear of our neighbors, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, very much. And also it set strong directions for the vision of advanced light water reactors in Europe. And definitely because this had been a reactivity type of accident as opposed to a cooling accident in 3 Mile Island. And because the RBMK had no containment, the future European light water reactors would have to have a strong containment. And you see here the different pictures on, let's say, the EPR with a very strong containment with a core catcher. And to compare to, let's say, this design by the American and Japanese industry that really worked out on simplifications that has not been being so much considered in the current design so far, but really worked on passive safety systems so as to really give more autonomy to this system, which was considered but not implemented so far in the current vision of the EPR. So those are two lines that are really offered today on the international market, and probably harmonizing, let's say, requests for the generation 3 type of reactors at the international level might help maybe the understanding of, let's say, newcomers to nuclear power. Now, for Fukushima, well, really the consequence was enormous. First of all, emotional, because it was the tsunami. But very soon, in fact, there was a confusion between the effect of the human effect of the tsunami and the nuclear accident that was caused by the fact that the nuclear plant had been hit by the earthquake first and by the flooding secondly. And this has been widely exploited, or I would say, by anti-nuclear, and this revived the negative sentiments of our neighbors in Europe. And certainly today, Western Europe is certainly the place of the world where, let's say, where the negative consequence of Fukushima on nuclear energy is still the more important. From the technical point of view, well, first of all nuclear countries, well, wanted to have a prompt recovery from this event, and this went through a whole program of checking and stress tests that was coordinated at the level of Europe. Of importance also was the fact that it was the first light water reactor that led to large release of radioactivity, and let's say France and Europe participated in international let's say endeavors to really account for the lessons of Fukushima. Certainly the fact that to be ready to manage the unforeseen events, to really reevaluate natural events, or to revisit rare events that could have really dramatic consequences. Also, one of the consequences was to enhance the emergency preparedness. And in fact, nuclear rapid reaction force was implemented in February this month, 350 persons on 4 sites in France to be ready to provide external cooling or external power supply to damaged nuclear power plants. So in brief, I wanted to tell you that in fact we came to nuclear for energy security reasons first, not for climate change reasons. But when these concerns that were brought by the European Commission came in addition, so energy efficiency and the deployment of other low carbon energy sources such as the renewable energies, well, just supplemented the initial, let's say, mix of energy that France has initiated. And we also joined the club of the countries that really aim at decreasing greenhouse gas effects. Team I had a strong impact in the nuclear community, but little in the population, and it was the reverse for Chernobyl and for Fukushima, and this really affects the current debate on the nuclear transition currently. We know some of the strong components of this energy policy: energy efficiency, diversified low carbon energy sources, but we don't know the exact let's say, stipulations that will be imposed to nuclear, especially whether numbers in terms of share of nuclear electricity or whether lifetimes will be really stipulated by this Energy Policy Act that we expect by the end of this year. Just to give you a flavor of what the debate on France energy transition debate occurs. So this is a newspaper article that was just published last Tuesday. A full page of one of the most referenced newspapers in France, Le Monde. And this was written by a French professor at Harvard University and by, let's say, a biochemist who is a member of the Academy of Science. And both made the point that, in fact, unlike the choices of the government, nuclear power and shale gas have a bright future in France, provided one avoid ideological bias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. A good view of what's going on in an important country. Finally, we'll hear from one of the nation's experts regarding the intersection of engineering and policy, public policy, which is a key relationship, obviously, in any consideration of nuclear power. M. Granger Morgan is professor and head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon. His research addresses problems in science, technology, and public policy with a particular focus on energy, environmental systems, climate change, and risk analysis. At Carnegie Mellon, Professor Morgan directs the National Science Foundation Center for Climate and Energy Decision Making. He previously served as the chair of the Science Advisory Board of the US EPA and the Advisory Council of the Electric Power Research Institutes. He has a BA in physics from Harvard, an MS in astronomy and space science from Cornell, PhD from the Department of Applied Physics and Information Sciences at the University of California at San Diego. And he grew up around here. Welcome home, Granger.
Thanks very much. You will notice that lacking from that introduction is very much work on nuclear, and I'll explain in a moment. But it's nice to be back here in Hanover. My grandfather, Frank Morgan, taught math at Dartmouth and wrote a lot of math textbooks, which actually the Hanover High School adopted, and so they were in use when I was a student there. My father, Millett Morgan, spent most of his career here at the Thayer School, building the radiophysics lab, starting the first bout of really serious research here. My wife, Betty Morgan, whose dad incidentally ran Nichols Hardware up in Lyme, beat me in every math course we ever took together at Hanover High, and I had the answer books. And the summer after we got married, came back and helped Kemeny and Kurtz write one of the first basic compilers. Dartmouth, in those days, had much better faculty benefits, so paid my way to Harvard, and we still have our family place here in Etna. So I'm going to do three things, but coming after 6 other very substantive talks, I basically get to skip the first of these things, which is nice. But I'll just say 2 quick things. While recent accidents have obviously not helped the development of nuclear power in the US, unlike the situation in much of Europe, I think the accidents are a secondary issue compared with this trend in gas. And so we are now shutting down perfectly viable nuclear plants because of the restructuring that puts a heavy emphasis on short-term economic decision-making. But we all know that sometime in the very near future, we got to get really serious about reducing CO2 emissions. And we're not going to be able to reopen these plants. And so I think that that's a real policy failure. I'm not going to talk about all the plants that are being built around the world or the ones that are planned, because you've already heard several descriptions of that. So let me start the substance by revisiting a paper I wrote 20 years ago titled, "What Would It Take to Revitalize Nuclear Power?" And in doing that, I'm going to talk particularly about the role of small modular reactors, because since I did this paper, I've done almost nothing on nuclear until just about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, when I started working a bit on SMRs. So in that paper, I argued that it was going to take 6 things to bring nuclear back in this country. What I'm going to do is walk through each one and comment a bit on sort of where we stand. So the first one was a shift in design philosophy. I argued that a shift was necessary for 2 reasons. Not just to make safety and reliability higher, but also to sort of reset public perceptions. And I shared an early version of this paper with Chauncey Starr, who at the time was running EPRI. And his comment was, "Granger, this is a great idea, but the problem is the enormous capital cost to develop new reactor designs. It's simply not going to happen. We're locked in to light water designs derivative from submarine propulsion systems, and it's going to stay like that. Now, today it's beginning to look like the situation has changed enough that Chauncey's argument may no longer be true. We see, as you heard earlier, active development of a variety of advanced or conventional light water and advanced designs particularly for small modular reactors. So that's the first of the six. The second was that I argued would be required was a shift in manufacturing philosophy. I mean, if we built nuclear reactors, reverse. If we build airplanes the way we build nuclear reactors, nobody in this room could afford to fly to Europe. I mean, because, they're custom made one at a time. Now, it's really hard to build an AP1000. You could build chunks of it, I suppose, in a factory. But with small modular reactors, it is indeed within the realm of plausibility that you could build these things in a factory and ship them out. And though that vision is still in its infancy, the present generation of designs will probably see only limited progress in that regard. It's still the case that this is a dream that's probably now within reach, and a number of the folks who are in the design business for SMRs are beginning to talk seriously about doing this. The next three, new regulatory apparatus, a new approach to waste, political will, and leadership, we've still got problems on all three of those fronts. The NRC has put together a group to begin to think about regulating SMRs, but essentially, of course, is operating in a reactive mode, and so until somebody shows up with a design and says, can you certify this, there's not a lot of proactive activity. I mean, the DOE is doing a lot of things proactively, but the NRC is sort of sitting, waiting for a design to come. Political will and leadership is singularly lacking, especially in some parts of Europe. And for all the talk of completely carbon-free energy systems based on wind and solar, my colleagues and I, when we run the numbers, we don't see how to get there without a combination of nuclear, but also fossil with carbon capture and sequestration. Yes, gas is half the carbon intensity of coal, but if you're going to get an 80 or 90% reduction in CO2 emissions, you're going to have to start scrubbing gas plants as well to do carbon capture and sequestration. So I think both of those are critical parts of our future. Now, here's my favorite John Kemeny quote. He was writing on this was in a piece he did on lessons from 3 Mile Island that he published in Technology Review, and he was writing on technologies that essentially require constant vigilance of the sort that nuclear certainly is. And he says, suppose Congress designed an airplane with each committee designing one component of it and an 11th hour conference committee deciding how the various pieces should be put together. And he asked, would any sane person fly on such an airplane? This is a commentary on the policy issues involved if you make these sorts of choices to go with technologies of this sort. The last one was strong protection against proliferation. And on that point, Chauncey was very much in agreement with my argument. He and Wolf Heflicke were among the first to develop proposals for internationalizing the fuel cycle. We've yet to make sufficient progress on this front, but if SMRs are going to see a large market across the developing world, my view is that progress will be essential. I'll come back to talk about some other things that also have to be dealt with if we're going to see wide deployment of SMRs. Two strategies that hold some real possibilities in this context are full life cycle build, own, operate, retrieve packages in which a supplier comes in, builds an SMR, and then takes full responsibilities. But there are problems, of course, with that in sovereign states. And a second is a full, secure, internationalized fuel waste system. On that first point, incidentally, the Russian barge-mounted reactor, which has actually been built and the reactors have been put in it, I'm not sure that they've actually been fueled yet, is an interesting possibility because there you never site it on land in a country, you put it offshore. Now in the Russian case, this is to power things in Siberia, but one could imagine similar things for coastal regions. So I want to conclude with some words about work that my colleagues and I have been doing on small modular reactors. Last summer, we published this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. This was an expert elicitation in which we conducted 16 detailed, multi-hour, face-to-face interviews with reactor experts. And we, in that case, supplied detailed information on the designs. We offered detailed stories about plant footprints for both single and then multiple reactors, SMRs on a single site, and we specified a set of different scenarios. For each scenario, we elicited a full probability density function of the cost of an nth of the kind, overnight cost of an nth of the kind plant. And here are the estimates for 1,000 megawatt plants. We built lots and lots of these, of course. And the reviewers looked at this and said, why should we believe the rest of the stuff? There's a factor of 2 or more here difference in these guys' estimates. Yes, and this is the plot of cost estimates before construction versus actual cost after construction. And you can see there's a good deal more than a factor of 2 in some of these cases. We've had a pretty sad history of cost control in manufacturing. We heard earlier that there has been efforts to control costs, and actually Paul Fishbeck on my faculty, with a former doctoral student now at Westinghouse, is working hard in this space. Factory manufacturing could help a lot on that one. Here are the overnight cost estimates, and I'm not going to take, since time is short, you can go find this paper. I'm not going to take time to go through it. Most of these experts think that the cost per kilowatt, it says kilowatt hour, that means kilowatt, will be higher for these first generation light water small modular reactors than for conventional large reactors. Not shown in this slide is also the assessment that almost certainly the capital cost for a new plant will be, the total capital cost will be lower than for a large plant, and that means that it won't be a bet the company proposition for many entities. We learned, for example, in the process of doing this work about a major U.S. chemical company that when they thought the Congress was going to get serious and start putting a cap on CO2 emissions, looked very seriously at SMR as a heat source. And all but 2 experts believe that if you could co-locate multiple units on a single site, that would reduce unit capital costs. Last November, teaming with an organization called the International Risk Governance Council and the Paul Scher Institute, which is the Swiss Federal National Nuclear Lab, we ran a workshop with 45 or so international experts to look at technical barriers and institutional arrangements to facilitate the development of SMRs. This was a real workshop in the sense that we had presentations, we had discussion, but then we had a 33-page workbook that everybody went through after each session to record their views. Since time is short, I won't walk you through the summary diagrams here of people's views about barriers and, in the developed world, factors that will help promote adoption, and similarly in the developing world. Instead, let me just summarize on a single slide. In OECD countries, economic factors dominate the list of characteristics that most contribute to the promotion of SMRs. In developing countries, institutional factors were seen as most important. On the other hand, we found it very troubling that most of the folks in the room, we had 3 from China, 1 from Korea, 2 from Russia, and a bunch of Europeans and Americans, hadn't thought very much about a number of issues that I'll mention on my last slide. Safety in design and operation seem to be important in both. Institutional factors seen as posing the greatest challenges are listed here. Our assessment is that Russia, China, and Korea are going to be the principal exporters in the near term, that the U.S. is not likely to play a major role in export. And if SMRs are widely deployed across the developing world, which of course is a dream, because once the U.S., Europe, and Russia, China, and Brazil begin to seriously decarbonize, then we're going to have to decarbonize the rest of the world. If they're going to be deployed in the developing world, 4 critical issues need to be addressed. Certification and licensing of plants in countries that at present have no regulatory system or regulators, or for the most part have even thought about it. Development of robust systems of emergency response and crisis management. Yes, these things are inherently much safer, But if you somehow did nevertheless get the contents of the core out into the environment, you're going to need immediate emergency response. Most of these countries aren't going to be in a position to deal with that. Whether we can ever develop an international emergency response system is unclear. Perhaps China is prepared to back its exporters and say, we'll come and run that, but I don't think the U.S. will do it. A viable approach to handling liability, most have not thought about it, and a much improved strategy for addressing the risks of nuclear proliferation. We actually have a substantial grant right now from the MacArthur Foundation to work the nuclear proliferation issue. Thanks.
Thank you to all three of our speakers, Dan, Frank, and Granger. Those are excellent presentations. Now let's get to your question. Our keynoter is here, but he's agreed to give us about 15 minutes, so let's open it up, please.
This is a question for Daniel. Are there any reactors in operation that have similar designs to the Fukushima Daiichi reactors? And if so, what's being done to address design deficiencies?
There are, and everything that can be is being done. It's interesting, you know, as soon as an accident, an international incident like Fukushima occurs, the entire nuclear industry immediately begins to analyze it, to ask the very question you asked: do we have similar technology here, and could the same flaw occur? Once you satisfied that question, you've got to go to the next level, though, and you've got to ask the question, okay, now that we've looked at what actually occurred at Fukushima, what could have occurred? What else came close? What other flaws does that analysis reveal? I think it's really been impressive the way that the industry has cross-communicated with each other as well as with their regulators to try and maximize the lessons learned coming out of Fukushima. You know, there is so much at stake with the possibility of a nuclear incident that safety absolutely has to be top of mind for every one of our unit operators, and we can't afford not to make it so. So, you know, we looked at, for example, the redundancy of the water pumps, the ability to deliver water at Fukushima, and ask the question, you know, do we have a different system in place? Do we have additional backup generation that would have been in place if this had happened here in the U.S.? The answer is yes, but the questions continue to be asked. What else can we learn from this?
What's an example of those reactors? Where are they located? Well, that's getting shut down. Is there one that has like proposed extension?
They've all received exemptions.
Yeah.
Some of them are voluntary.
Pilgrim, I think, is a sister unit.
Okay, next question.
Why are the labor costs and the number of personnel for running a nuclear power plant an order of magnitude higher than for other kinds of energy? Is it regulations? Is it security costs? Is it the lack of automation of the equipment? Is it the same in France as in the U.S.?
Yes. It's all of those things. Absolutely. You know, the level of redundancy with regard to safety that you have to have at a nuclear power plant is just very different from when you're operating a fossil fuel plant. And it requires a high level of skill associated with the operation of these plants. There are a lot of systems, redundant systems, backup systems to the redundant systems. There's an enormous level of regulatory oversight, too. The slightest thing happens at a nuclear plant, it gets logged, it gets reported, it gets shown to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission people that are on site at the plant. There's a level of oversight that goes with the responsibility of operating a nuclear plant that requires that level of labor. I don't actually know what the labor costs are in France and how you do the currency conversions, but I imagine that similar to here in the States, it's a highly skilled and well-paid workforce.
Right here.
Interested that somebody brought up the proliferation issues, particularly considering that Korea developed out of their bomb was out of a commercial program. India was out of a research program, and we're worried about Iran using their peaceful centrifuges for their commercial programs to generate highly enriched uranium that might be used for bombs. How do you control that with, as you put it, sovereign countries? How do you stop the proliferation?
Well, I mean, if I can't get my hands on the content of the core, then I can control it that way. And there are folks, actually, I mentioned that we have this MacArthur grant. We are one of three institutions, John Steinbrenner and others at Maryland, and then a group at Princeton. The three groups are working together on these issues. The Russian floating reactor is an interesting approach because, you know, I can bring it up, park it, and there is a bit of history of using naval nuclear vessels for emergency situations, though the U.S. Navy certainly doesn't want to get into the business of being the backup power supplier for major events. But it's a tough problem. I mean, one of the visions that's kicked around out there is that, oh, I'll not only make these things in a factory, but then I'll ship them out fully fueled, I'll plug them in, run them, and bring them back so that I never open them up. We've broached those issues in this workshop I described, which was full of really first-rate reactor designers who sort of snickered and said, not in our lifetime. I mean, the problems of dealing with residual heat are non-trivial. So you almost certainly, for these first and probably even second generation plants, there are some of these plants that there's some designs that will run for many decades without opening them up and refueling. But you will, for certainly the first generation light water designs, have to refuel in the field, which does raise problems, which is what we're working on.
Over here.
This is a question for Frank Carré. Could you tell us the status of...
And speak up.
Yes. Could you tell us the status of the debate within France for the geological repository for nuclear waste?
Well, I might not be as accurate as you might expect, but I think the debate, is over now, and that I think it is completed, and that, in fact, I don't know exactly the situation. I just know that I believe it developed over the fall of 2013. I believe. I don't know whether it's continuing or not at the moment. There is a slight expectation that maybe the geological repository be shifted by a couple of years, but I don't know exactly the reasons why. So,
Could I add just a word?
Please.
More generally on waste repositories. I didn't take the time to elaborate, but in that paper of 20 years ago, I argued that, you know that under U.S. law, basically, for a long time, the argument was we've got to be able to build a repository where we can put stuff in and then walk away and be sure that nothing happens for 10,000 years or so. And you only need to spend a few minutes with any first-rate geologist to figure out that you basically can't assure that with the sorts of probabilities that one wants. And so in this country, I mean, we're gradually moving towards the notion that we're going to build repositories where you can monitor. I mean, even then, we would have monitored and so on. But we clearly need to build repositories that are monitored and retrievable, because you just cannot provide geologic assurance that for tens of thousands of years, nothing's going to happen.
In the back. And speak up, please.
Thank you. This is a question for Mr. Ali or anyone else on the panel that cares to comment on this. For developing countries that look to utilize nuclear power and at the same time try to build up regulatory capacity, is it a good idea for these countries to consider multiple options, multiple designs, or is it a good idea for them to focus on probably a single set of nuclear designs? Based on the history of nuclear power in the United States, how does the NRC handle these regulatory issues?
It's an excellent question. The challenge in answering it is that Seabrook Station was the last nuclear plant to come online in the U.S., and it came online in 1989. It's been a long time since we've built a new reactor here in the States, and so I'm not sure Exelon's experience with the current American fleet is necessarily going to be the most instructive. I'd actually defer to my colleague, Monsieur Carré, for his thoughts on it.
Well, in fact, we made a choice in France to have, let's say, a standardized, let's say, unit. It is said this is a very difficult choice because at the same time you have the gain in the standardization, but on the other side you are more vulnerable to any, let's say, common mode type of difficulty. And this occurred a few times, especially on our 1300 megawatt electric reactors. So there is really a balance. There are benefits in standardization, but in other sense there is robustness in having some diversity. But this is very interesting because, let's say, well, this could lead to some difference between the United States and France. The United States is really, I would say, non-standardized, and also there are various utilities, not only utilities. And I would say that the relationships between the safety authority and one unique utility or diverse utilities is, I would say, a bit different. I believe that in the US, well, I think things are more objectivized in sense that there are really rules, and if you comply those, then this is, let's say, this is within the limit assigned by the safety authority. The discussion of our safety authority with a unique utility at the moment is really beyond that, striving to have the utility moving as well to as much as possible to the safer side until it becomes economically unacceptable. And I think the situation would be different if there was a second nuclear utility, let's say, operating reactors in France.
You know, the one thing I can think of to add is whether you go with a single technology or a diversity, it's important to have more than one supplier. I think the experience of Canada, where they adopted the CANDU reactor as their standard technology, but found themselves vulnerable to the financial fortunes of one company, AECL as the sole manufacturer of that technology, proved somewhat problematic. And I think there's probably benefit in at least having a diversity of suppliers, if not designs.
Granger, you want the final word?
Sure. I guess I would argue that while some standardization is essential, and certainly standardization in the design of any particular supplier type, that in terms of nuclear in the developing world, which was what you were focused on, the other issues I listed at the end there in terms of actually developing regulatory capability, developing the ability either nationally or internationally to respond in the event of accidents, dealing with liability. I mean, would you, so some third world country says, okay, we're gonna cap liability, but you know, does the nation actually have the resources to make that happen in the same way that, for example, Florida is now essentially self-insuring for major hurricanes? But you know very well that if a major hurricane flattens Miami, everybody in this room is going to help pay for it because Florida isn't going to have the resources. And lastly, once again, there are these proliferation issues, which I think are much more serious than many folks have thought.
Let's give our panel a big round of applause.